We spend so much of our lives online, right? We're clicking, posting, sharing, but have you ever stopped to think about the rules behind it all? Today, we're going to look at a huge court case that basically drew a line in the sand, a line that decides if a simple click is just a click or if it could be a crime.
I mean, think about it. Is just liking or sharing something a crime? It's a question that sounds kind of crazy, but it was a very real possibility. You see, back in 2012, the government passed this big law called the Cybercrime Prevention Act. The idea was to bring some order to the internet, but it also kicked off this massive legal fight about our online freedoms, a fight that ended up at the Supreme Court.
So, here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the big challenge to the law. Then, we'll see what parts the court said were okay and which parts they threw out. We'll get into the why behind their decision and wrap up with what this all means for you and me.
Okay, so let's set the scene. The Cybercrime Act gets passed, and almost immediately a whole bunch of people challenged it. They said, hey, this law goes way too far. All those challenges got rolled into one huge case, Disini versus the Secretary of Justice. And really what was on trial was the future of free speech online.
And what the court did here was pretty fascinating. They didn't just look at the law and say, yep, it's good, or nope, it's bad. Instead, they treated it like a giant sieve. They poured the entire law through this constitutional filter. Some parts, the good stuff, passed right through, but other parts, the ones that clashed with our basic rights, got caught in the filter and were tossed out. This visual right here is basically our map of what made it through and what didn't.
All right, so first up, what actually made it through that constitutional sieve? Let's talk about the parts of the law the court decided to keep.
Well, a lot of the no-brainers stayed, things like hacking, data sabotage, cyber squatting, buying up domain names just to mess with people, identity theft, and of course the absolutely horrible stuff like child pornography. These are the kinds of common sense rules we pretty much all agree are necessary. They also kept the rule on cyber libel, but, and this is a huge but, it came with a major catch.
And the catch was this. The court said if you're the one who actually writes and posts something libelous, then yeah, you can be held responsible. You're the author, you're on the hook. Simple as that. This was key because it held creators accountable, but it also opened the door for a massive protection for the rest of us.
Okay, so that's what passed the test. But what about the stuff that got caught in the filter? What did the Supreme Court look at and say, nope, this isn't going to fly?
Well, they tossed out a few big things. A rule about unsolicited commercial communications, basically spam, was out. So was a rule that let the government block access to your data without a warrant. But the real game changer, the one that affects pretty much everyone online, was their decision on cyber libel.
This is where that clear line was drawn. Look, on one side, you have the author, the person who actually created the libelous post. The court said they're responsible. But on the other side, you have, well, everybody else, the millions of us who just like, share, or comment on things. The court decided it was totally unconstitutional to punish those people. And with that one move, they basically protected the way we all talk and interact online.
And that wasn't the only win for online rights. Remember that part about the government being able to block data? The court struck that down too. They saw it for what it was, a really dangerous censorship tool. They ruled that if the government wants to block something, they need to get a court order first. They can't just do it on their own. That's a huge protection against random content takedowns.
So we've covered the what was kept, what was tossed. But now for the really interesting part, the why. Why did the court make these calls? To get that, we need to look at the legal ideas that basically made up the mesh in that constitutional sieve.
The biggest reason, number one with a bullet, is freedom of expression. The court was worried about something called a chilling effect. Think about it. If you knew that just liking or sharing a post could get you dragged into a lawsuit, would you still do it? Of course not. You'd be scared to engage with anything controversial. That fear would just freeze online conversations solid. The court saw that danger and put a stop to it.
Then there's this idea called the overbreadth doctrine. It basically means a law can't be a sledgehammer when you need a scalpel. The original law had this really vague language about aiding or abetting libel. The problem was, it was so broad it could punish perfectly legal actions. It was kind of like throwing a giant fishing net into the ocean to catch one specific type of fish, but you end up catching dolphins, sea turtles, and everything else in the process. The court said, nope, this law needs to be way more specific. And finally, the court used the toughest legal test there is, strict scrutiny. Anytime a law touches a fundamental right like freedom of speech, it has to clear this incredibly high bar. The government has to prove two things. First, that they have a really, really good reason for the law, and second, that the law is the most narrowly focused way to get the job done. And when it came to punishing people for just liking or sharing a post, the government just couldn't make that case. They couldn't clear the bar.
Okay, so let's tie this all together. We've talked about the law, the court's decision, and all the legal jargon. But what does this actually mean for you right now as you're scrolling through your phone or computer?
Honestly, if you remember just one thing from all of this, make it this. The court drew a clear line. You can be held responsible for what you create, but not for what you simply share or amplify. There's a huge difference between being the author of something and just being part of the conversation about it.
So what does this mean for you in practical terms? It means you can like, share, and comment on things without the fear of getting sued for libel. It means the government can't just block data without a court order. And it means we're protected from these super vague laws that could accidentally turn normal online behavior into a crime.
Look, the Disini case was a massive win for our rights in the digital world, but this whole thing is far from over, right? Technology is always changing. With things like AI and deepfakes getting more and more realistic, the lines between creating something and sharing it are getting blurrier than ever. So the real question for the future is, where does the next line get drawn?